Hello everybody, Treno here, and welcome to this next episode of my series looking at interwar tanks that I think should be added to War Thunder. And today we will be taking a look at Japanese tanks of the interwar period. So a quick recap of Japan's situation after World War I. Japan had entered the war on the side of the Entente, but didn't take part in the fighting on the Western Front, instead being involved in seizing German possessions in the Pacific and China, with many of these territories being given to Japan at the war's end. However, this meant that its first tanks were not built domestically, but instead came from its allies in Britain and France, allowing Japan to gain some experience with tanks despite not actually being able to build their own. On the face of things, it does seem like Japan was in a very good situation after the war. After all, Japan became one of the 4 original permanent members of the League of Nations, which was a sort of forerunner to the United Nations of today, and had many powerful allies. However, despite being close to Britain and the other Western nations up to this point, Japan failed to get its racial equality proposal adopted in the Treaty of Versailles, despite a majority of delegates voting for it, which caused some resentment in Japan, as Japan was the only major non-white power in the world at the time. So the failure to adopt their proposal was seen as a bit of a snub towards Japan as an Asian power. Things became worse during the Washington Naval Treaty, which placed restrictions on the size and number of capital ships that each nation could have in service, with the ratio being set at 525,000 tons total for Britain and America, but Japan only got 315,000 tons total, meaning Japan would have less capital ships and thus be a disadvantage in a war against either power. Now, in theory, this wasn't such a huge problem because Japan was allied with Britain, which meant that in theory the only power they had to really fear was the United States. And in the event of a war, Japan should in theory have the backing of the Royal Navy, which was the largest navy of the time. However, the Americans had made it clear they wouldn't sign the Washington Naval Treaty if the alliance was still in effect, so the treaty was terminated in 1923, leaving Japan isolated on the world stage, which was a situation that would lead Japan to move more towards militarism and expansion in Asia, which would in a few decades culminate in the invasion of China, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the invasion of European colonies in Asia. So for our first tank, we'll be taking a look at the prototype number 1, or Type 87 Chi medium tank, which was Japan's first attempt at creating its own domestically designed tank. So this design came about in 1925 when Japan decided it wanted to have its own tank force. Until now, they had relied on foreign-built tanks, and indeed there was interest in buying newer tanks like the British Vickers medium tank. But Britain was unwilling to sell any of this tank, as they didn't even have enough of this tank for their own army. This meant that older World War I models like the Renault FT-17 would be Japan's only options for imported tanks, at a time when it was recognised that these tanks were becoming far too old and obsolete for the modern battlefield. The Army Technical Headquarters, being aware of the FT-17's obsolescence, was firmly against buying any more of this type of tank, and instead recommended that Japan develop its own domestic tank design. And despite some scepticism on its chances of success, in June 1925 they were given 2 years to design and produce the new tank from scratch. Interestingly, one of the people involved in pushing forward the design of this tank was Tomio Hara, who would go on to be a major figure in Japanese tank design and involved in many of Japan's major tanks in the following decades, as well as writing a few of the profile AFV weapon books, which I will be using as one of the sources for this video. The prototype would be finished in February 1927 and would weigh 18 tons, with an armour thickness of 17mm, though this was made from soft steel for the prototype as armour plate wasn't available, while the armament consisted of a 57mm gun in the main turret, while 2 7.7mm machine guns were housed in their own turrets, one at the front of the tank and one at the rear. Meanwhile, the top speed was 12.4 miles per hour or 20 kilometers an hour on 6 forward gears and 2 reverse gears, much faster than the previous World War I era tanks, while the Type 87 was manned by a crew of 5, consisting of a driver in the hull, gunner and commander in the main turret, and the 2 machine gunners in their own individual turrets. In War Thunder, I think the Type 87 would fit in at about battle rating 0.7, as the tank has a decent if not spectacular amount of armour, an okay speed, and a 57mm gun that might struggle against modern tanks, but should do decently well against other interwar tanks, and would give Japanese players a chance to experience the first Japanese designed and produced tank. In real life, the Type 87 showed that Japan, despite having not built tanks before and having a limited automotive industry, could indeed design and produce its own tanks. However, the Type 87 hadn't quite met the specifications laid out when commencing the design, being 5 km slower than the required 25 km/h top speed, that speed being the same as the standard Japanese army cargo truck, and it also weighed 3 more tons than required. So while much experience was gained, ultimately the design was a bit of a dead end, though it would later be developed into the Type 91 and 95 heavy tanks. So the Type 87, while being a good attempt and giving Japanese engineers the experience needed to create further tank designs, wasn't really the design that Japan wanted to put into production. However, in 1926 Japan had learnt of a new design by Vickers in the UK, named the Vickers Medium Mark C. So Japan had decided to buy a single example of this design, mainly with an eye on taking inspiration from its design rather than putting it into full-scale production. And the tank was delivered to Japan in March 1927, about the same time that Japan was putting the Type 87 through testing. Straight away, one of the big advantages to this tank was its speed, which maxed out at 18 miles per hour or 30 km an hour on a 165 horsepower petrol engine, far faster than the Type 87, and even faster than the Japanese specifications had called for on that tank, as well as being far lighter at only 11.3 tonnes, so again 7 tonnes lighter than the Type 87, which no doubt did wonders for its mobility. As for its armament, the main weapon was the low-velocity 6-pounder 57mm gun, which doesn't seem to have been a standard weapon fitted to other tanks, so details are a bit sketchy. But we do know that it had a muzzle velocity of only 365 metres a second, so armour-piercing shells would likely have a lacklustre performance with this gun, though HE shells would be unaffected and might provide a better option for players. Meanwhile, 4 7.7mm machine guns made up the secondary armament, one at the rear of the turret, one to the left of the driver in the hull, and then one each on the right and left side of the tank, giving a bit of extra defence against soft-skin targets. However, despite being a medium tank, the Mark C had very thin armour at only 6.5mm thick, the same thickness as the Vickers Mark 1 and 2 medium tanks, which would make this an extremely vulnerable tank to practically every weapon on the battlefield, including many machine guns. Lastly, the medium Mark C standard crew seems to have been 4, consisting of a driver in the hull and the commander, gunner and loader in the turret, but it seems that a 5th crew member could also be carried when needed, presumably to man the machine guns. In War Thunder, the medium Mark C could probably go at 0.7 like the Type 87, possibly as a premium vehicle, as it now has a faster top speed but potentially a worse gun, while also having virtually no armour. But it could still give some good service in game, and it would be nice for this tank that would help influence future tank designs to have a place in game. With the Vickers Medium Mark C now in their possession, along with Vickers engineers, Japan began testing the tank. However, during one of these tests, an incident occurred, where, to quote Tommy O'Hara, gasoline fumes from the carburetor overflow during a steep climb seeped inside the tank and ignited from engine backfire. The engine was burned out and both engineers were badly scaled. End quote. With the tank damaged, it would be sent to Mitsubishi for repairs, which gained Japan yet more experience on repairing tanks, but more importantly would alert Japanese engineers to the dangers of petrol engines, and spur a desire to adopt a diesel engine for future designs, as these would represent less of a fire hazard, as well as giving a few other advantages like being better for fuel consumption than petrol engines. So Japan now had one domestically designed tank under its belt and one foreign built design from which to take inspiration, which meant that the next tank design, the Type 89, would be a far better designed tank, indeed probably one of the best in the world at the time of its creation, with the tank going into production in 1931. Now you might recall we do technically have this tank in game as the Type 89B Ai-Go-Ko, which did initially cause me some confusion when researching this video, but basically this is an amalgamation of 2 of the major Type 89 variants. So we're just going to start from the beginning to try and cause less confusion. So the first Type 89 to go into production was the A variant, which was fitted with a 118 horsepower petrol engine, had 2 plates for the frontal hull, had a saucepan cupola, had the machine gunner on the right and the driver on the left, and had a slightly different turret design. These were also armed with 57mm guns, but some sources say that the first few tanks were armed initially with Type 11 37mm guns, so potentially you've got 2 variants there that could be added. The next major variant is the Type 89B, which is the variant that had a diesel engine, a 120 horsepower Mitsubishi diesel engine, and this is quite similar in other respects to the variant we've got in game, for example having the split hatch cupola, 1 plate for the whole front, but now had the machine gunner on the left and the driver on the right, and potentially a different top speed due to having a diesel engine. So all of these variants could be added either at 1.0 while having access to the heat round, or some of the earlier variants could be added at 0.7 without access to the heat round, which would justify placing these at a lower battle rating, where its stock shell will have a much greater success against other interwar tanks, and generally it would be nice to see all of the major Type 89 tank variants added in-game. So Japan now had an excellent tank ready to go into production, but as a stopgap measure while waiting for it to go into production and be delivered in large numbers, and also just to keep an eye on how tank development was going on in Europe, Japan ordered 10 to 23 examples of the French NC-27, which was essentially the export name of the French NC-1, which had been intended as a potential successor to the Renault FT-17, which I've also covered in my episode looking at French interwar tanks. In Japanese service it would be called the Otsu or Otsugata Sencha, and they would make a number of modifications to these tanks. For example, they replaced the original engine with a more powerful Mitsubishi engine with a top speed of 12.4 miles per hour or 20 kilometers an hour, while the 37mm SA-18 was replaced with a Japanese Type 11 37mm gun, which was based off of the French weapon but had a longer barrel, giving it more muzzle velocity and thus armour penetration, which should make it more effective than the original French weapon, though it should be noted that in-game the Type 11 only fires HE shells at the moment. The maximum armour is 25mm, though I have seen a few references to the armour being improved, but no specifics, and the crew count remains at 2, being a driver and a commander. I could see the Otsu being added at a battle rating of 0.7, with perhaps the original tank added as a premium tank and the modified version in the regular tech tree, as it gives Japanese players access to a rather effective and unique tank, showcasing Japanese improvements of foreign designs, and allowing Japanese players to experience a lesser known tank. In real life, the NC-27 wasn't considered as good of a tank as the Type 89, and was only considered equal to the FT-17, but Japan still put them to use alongside the Type 89, which was during the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which came about when the Kwangtung army based in the area decided to invade, conquer and establish the puppet state of Manchukuo, with the former Chinese Emperor Puyi put in place as their puppet. Of course, the League of Nations wrote a very strongly worded report, to which Japan had no choice but to do what the League of Nations said. Only kidding, they basically just walked out of the League of Nations, and that was that. The incident also shows that the army was increasingly in charge rather than the civilian government in Japan, as they hadn't actually sanctioned the invasion, and this set the stage for the upcoming Second Sino-Japanese War. So Japan now had some excellent tanks for the time, which would give service in the various conflicts and wars with China in the 1930s, but when the cavalry tested the Type 89, they found the tank to be too slow for their needs, so a new design was designed for their use. Interestingly, in 1932, when these discussions were taking place, Tommy O'Hara was able to view a Christie tank with the all-new Christie suspension, which might have provided the solution for a fast tank that they were looking for. But unlike the Soviets, Polish and British, who would all go on to adopt or try to adopt the new suspension for their new tanks, the Japanese turned it down due to poor test results and mechanical issues, so Japan would instead develop a cavalry tank domestically. However, like in the United States, the cavalry wasn't technically allowed to have their own tanks, so the resulting design would be designated the Type 92 combat car to get around this restriction. The resulting design had a top speed of 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour from a 45 horsepower petrol engine, so was much faster than the Type 89, while also being extremely light at only 3.9 tonnes, so well suited to getting around the battlefield quickly. Unfortunately, the rest of its stats aren't great, with its armament consisting of only one Type 92 13mm machine gun mounted in the hull, which is basically the French 13mm Hotchkiss machine gun in Japanese service, and in-game this has a penetration of 25mm at 100 metres, which is decent enough at the lower tiers and for against other interwar tanks, but would struggle against more modern tanks, while a Type 91 6.5mm machine gun is also carried in the turret. I could see this being added at around 0.7 to 1.0, as while not the best armed or armoured design, its 13mm machine gun should still perform decently well at the lower tiers, while its higher speed will allow it to get around the battlefield, flank enemies, do scouting work and cap points, which might make this a fun tank for players to use. In real life, the Type 92 didn't stick around for very long, suffering from various technical problems and a weak suspension, so a follow-up design would be needed. In 1930, Japan received 6 Carden-Loyd Mark VI tankettes, but felt the design was too small, so created the Type 94 tankette, which was more similar to the Vickers light tanks of the day, and due to its cheapness, only 50,000 yen versus 98,000 yen for the Type 95 Hargo, this became the most produced Japanese tank of the 1930s, with 823 being produced. Unfortunately, it was armed only with small caliber machine guns, which wasn't a problem in real life, where it wasn't really expected to go against other enemy tanks, but does mean it couldn't be added in-game. But the follow-up design, designated the Type 97 T-Key, could be. The first T-Key prototype was fitted with a front-mounted engine and a rear-mounted turret, but due to issues with the initial prototype, a second prototype would be created with the engine moved further to the rear, and this is the version accepted for service. Unlike the Type 94, the Type 97 T-Key was armed with a much more effective Type 94 37mm gun, with an in-game penetration of 27mm at 500 metres, while having a maximum armour thickness of 16mm, a top speed of 25 mph or 40 km/h on a 65 horsepower diesel engine, and a crew of 2, consisting of a driver in the hull and commander in the turret. In-game this could be added at 1.0, as it has a much more effective anti-tank weapon now to pair with its quick speed, though it's still let down by its not great armour and 2-man crew, but could still find great success as a flanking and scout vehicle. In 1939, the T-Key would replace the Type 94 in production, and would become the 4th most produced Japanese tank design of the 1930s, with 558 being produced during this time. Though like other Japanese designs, it would struggle when going up against modern opponents in World War II. So Japan seemed to be doing well with its current lineup of tanks, which includes all of the tanks we've looked at and the Type 95 Hargo, which would come into service in the 1930s. But by 1935, Japan had started to learn of further tank developments in other nations, like the A6 medium tank in the UK, and felt that an improved medium tank that was faster, better armed and armoured than the existing Type 89 would be required. However, as Japan was still technically at peace, the requirements were set with an assumption that the tank would be cheaper and less capable. But as there was some opposition to this, Mitsubishi would be contracted to develop a more expensive but more capable design, which would be designated the Chiha, while the Osaka Army Arsenal tackled the cheaper design, which would be designated the Chi-Ni. The resulting Chi-Ni prototype would have a top speed of 18.6 mph or 30 km/h on a 135 horsepower engine, so faster than the Type 89, while carrying a 57mm gun and one machine gun mounted in the hull, while the armour was to max out at 25mm and a 3-man crew was to be carried, consisting of a driver and machine gunner in the hull and the commander in the turret. So one less than the Type 89, making this more susceptible in-game to being knocked out via crew losses, and increasing crew workloads in real life. In-game, I could see the Chi-Ni being added at 1.0, possibly as a premium vehicle, or in the regular tech tree just before the Type 97 Chiha, as it would essentially be a smaller, slower and slightly more vulnerable tank compared to the Chiha, so would allow players to have less of a jumping capability as they progress along the Japanese tech tree. So the Chini prototype was constructed, and trials were being conducted for both the Chini and Chi-Ha when the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937, which in many ways could be considered the start of World War II, but at the time was probably considered more of a localised conflict. However, with Japan now on a war footing, there was no need for the cheaper Chini design, so the more effective Chi-Ha was put into production instead. However, Tomio Hara does seem to suggest that in hindsight the Chini would have made for a perfectly good light tank, so clearly if things had gone differently, it might have still seen service. So as we can see, Japan had a whole plethora of light and medium tank designs which would prove themselves invaluable in the conflict against China, and even against the Allied powers in World War II. But there was also some work geared towards heavy tanks, which resulted in the Type 91 heavy tank. This was done by modifying the existing Type 87 Chi-I design, initially with a 150 horsepower engine, though this was later upgraded to a modified 224 horsepower BMW aircraft engine, had a reduced weight of 18 metric tons, and replaced the 57mm gun with a 70mm gun, which in-game has a penetration of just 18mm with its stock APHE shell, or 80mm with the Type 3 heat shell. It also retains the two machine gun turrets at the front and rear of the tank for use against soft skin targets. Beyond this, the Type 91 was to have a maximum armour thickness of 20mm, be capable of a top speed of 12.4 miles per hour or 20 kilometers an hour, from a 224 horsepower BMW aircraft engine, and have a crew of 5. In-game, I could see this being a 0.7 to 1.0 tank, being quite similar to the initial Type 87 Chi-I, with some slight improvements, and while not a great tank design, I could see this having some success in-game, either as a premium or event vehicle, or even as a successor to the Type 87 on the regular tech tree. So ultimately, despite the reputation they sometimes get when looking at their performance in World War II, Japan was at the cutting edge of tank technology, as well as producing more tanks than pretty much any other nation besides the Soviet Union, with 3,492 tanks being produced between 1931 and 1940. However, while these tanks gave good service in China, by 1939 some designs like the Type 89 were almost a decade old, and equipped with weapons more suited for infantry support than against enemy tanks. This ended up being a problem in the summer of 1939, when Japanese tanks would end up going against Soviet tanks in the Nomonhan incident, or Battle of Khalkhin Gol, a border conflict that ended up escalating to the point where tens of thousands of troops would be killed or wounded. During this conflict, the Japanese Yasoka 1st Tank Group, consisting primarily of Type 89s and Type 95s, would attack the Soviet 9th Moto Armoured Brigade, and while they managed to get through their defences, they would lose 42 of the 73 tanks it deployed, in large part due to the effective 45mm gun the Soviet tanks carried. The Japanese did manage to recover and repair all but 13 of its knocked out tanks, and claimed to have knocked out 32 Soviet BT tanks in return, but the group was withdrawn from the battlefield, and any idea of future Japanese expansion northward was halted, instead focusing southwards towards the European colonies, while work on producing more tanks and outfitting them with modern 47mm guns would commence, setting the stage for Japanese tank development in World War II. Japan, of course, did have many amphibious tank designs, but these mostly came later and are already in-game. But there is at least one interwar amphibious tank design that could be added, which is the amphibious tank SR2. The tank weighed in at 4 tons and was extremely lightly armed and armoured, being fitted with one 13.2mm machine gun in the turret and one light machine gun in the bow, while the armour was only 6mm thick. That said, it was decently fast, with a top speed on land of 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour, and 5 miles per hour or 8 kilometers an hour on water, while a 3-man crew operated the tank. I could see this being added at 0.7 to 1.0, as it is extremely vulnerable to enemies, while its 13.2mm machine gun will struggle against more armoured enemies, but it will do well in flanking attacks, and with its amphibious capabilities it will give Japanese players more opportunities in battle, making this a fun and unique tank to have in game. Unfortunately, Japan doesn't seem to have had much in the way of SPG vehicles during this time, but there were 2 experimental designs based on the Type 95 chassis, with one of these already in game as the Rogo Experimental. However, we could still get the Giro, which is laid out differently to the Rogo Experimental in that its armament is mounted at the rear of the vehicle instead of the front and looks to be fully enclosed, giving some extra protection. The gun used was the Type 92 105mm cannon, which could fire a 15.76kg shell at 765 meters a second, so will no doubt one-shot most enemy tanks it could encounter in-game. As for the rest of its stats, it should have roughly the same top speed of 14 mph or 23 km/h as the Rogo Experimental, while presumably it would have a crew of 6, one less than the Experimental due to not having a machine gun turret at the rear like on that vehicle, while armour thickness will also be similar at 25 to 30mm for the hull, though likely thinner for the fighting compartment. Like the Rogo Experimental, only one Giro was produced, but it could work in-game at a battle rating of 1.7 like the Experimental, having a good main gun but being vulnerable to flanking enemies. Lastly, there is at least one truck-mounted weapon named the Shisei, which was officially an anti-air vehicle fitted with a 75mm gun. No doubt it would be extremely vulnerable to enemy fire and probably slow-moving, while not being terribly effective against fast-moving aircraft. But against tanks it might have some success, and would likely have a 5 to 6 man crew to man the vehicle and gun, giving some redundancy against crew losses, and could probably be added to the game at around 1.3 or so depending on the gun's effectiveness. So that's it for this episode looking at Japanese interwar tanks that I would like to see added to War Thunder, and I'd be interested to see your views on these vehicles and any other tanks you would like me to cover in the comments below. As for the next episode, it will definitely be on Italian interwar tanks, so hopefully you're looking forward to that. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the episode, hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Terreno, and I'll see you next time.